What if a single act of kindness could rewrite your entire future? On a dreary Tuesday morning in 1992, Daniel "Danny" Carter, a 28-year-old Marine veteran, sat in a small Nebraska diner, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Fresh from the sands of Desert Storm, Danny had been struggling to find his footing in civilian life. The skills that made him a stellar squad leader in Kuwait felt useless at his new job as a mechanic in the sleepy town of Willow Creek. With his buzzed hair still sharp and a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, Danny carried the weight of his service in silence, his heart heavy with a transition he couldn't quite master. The air outside was thick with rain, the kind that soaks through your bones, and inside Mabel's diner, the warmth of coffee and the clatter of dishes offered a fleeting comfort. But for Danny, comfort was a distant memory, replaced by the ache of a purpose he couldn't find. That morning, as rain tapped against the diner's fogged-up windows, Danny sipped his black coffee, its bitterness a mirror to his mood, waiting for his usual plate of scrambled eggs and toast. The diner was quiet, save for a few locals nursing their own cups, and an elderly man sitting alone in a corner booth, his presence a quiet mystery. Something about the man caught Danny's eye. Maybe it was the careful way he arranged his worn leather wallet, a faded handkerchief that smelled faintly of tobacco, and a small metal object that glinted under the dim lights, its edges worn smooth from years of being handled. When the man began counting coins to pay his bill, stacking them with trembling hands, each penny and nickel placed with a deliberate care that spoke of dignity, Danny felt a pang of recognition. He'd seen that look before in his father's eyes, a quiet pride masking a storm of struggle, a battle fought in silence. The man's hands shook, not just from age, but from a weariness that Danny knew too well, a weight that came from carrying more than coins. Now, imagine you're Danny, watching this scene unfold, the rain outside a steady drumbeat, the diner's warmth a fragile shield against the cold. What would you do next? Would you quietly pay for the man's meal and slip away unnoticed, hoping to spare him the embarrassment? Or would you approach him directly, offering help face to face, risking an awkward encounter that might bruise his pride? Share your choice in the comments below. Let's see what you'd do in Danny's shoes. And if stories like this, tales of quiet heroism and unexpected connections, touch your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories for more narratives that remind us of the power of kindness in the most ordinary moments. Underscore. Body. Deep storytelling with emotional peaks and suspense. Danny's life in Willow Creek was a stark contrast to the adrenaline of Desert Storm, where every moment had been a fight for survival. At 28, he lived in a sparse one-bedroom apartment, the walls echoing with the silence of a life stripped of purpose. He sent half his paycheck to his father in Minnesota, who was battling Parkinson's disease, a slow thief that stole his father's strength one tremble at a time, leaving Danny with a guilt that gnawed at him for being so far away. The apartment was a blank canvas. Its walls held only two items: his honorable discharge certificate, the ink slightly faded like a memory he couldn't hold on to, and a grainy photo of his unit, their faces frozen in a moment of camaraderie he longed to reclaim, their laughter a ghost in his mind. Each morning followed the same rhythm: coffee at Mabel's diner, the bitter brew a ritual that grounded him, then a grueling shift at Harper's auto shop, where he wrestled with engines that reminded him of the Humvees he'd maintained in the desert. The smell of oil and metal was a bittersweet comfort, a tether to a past where he'd known his role, where orders were clear and the enemy was visible. But purpose? That was a ghost he couldn't catch, a shadow that slipped through his fingers with every turn of the wrench. The other mechanics admired his precision but kept their distance, unsure how to bridge the gap with the quiet veteran whose screams sometimes pierced the night, waking the building with echoes of a war they couldn't understand. His landlord, Mr. Thompson, a Vietnam vet with a limp and a knowing gaze, understood in a way others couldn't. They had a silent pact. Danny fixed Thompson's old Chevy for free, its engine purring like a memory of better days, the hum a reminder of the vehicles he'd kept running under fire. And Thompson overlooked the occasional late rent, his gruff exterior hiding a heart that recognized Danny's struggle, a shared language of survival that needed no words. 8 years in the Marines had honed Danny's instincts: assess, act, adapt, a mantra that had kept him alive in the desert. That morning, as he watched the elderly man struggle with his coins, those instincts roared to life, a call to action he couldn't ignore. The man's hands shook, not just from age but from a deeper weariness Danny knew too well, a weight that came from carrying battles no one else could see. It was the same look he'd seen in his father's eyes when the medical bills piled up, a quiet pride masking a storm of worry, a dignity that refused to bend even under the heaviest load. The man's fingers, gnarled and slow, moved with a deliberate care that spoke of honor, each coin placed with intention as if it were a medal, a testament to a life of service. The waitress, Clara, stood by patiently, her apron stained with coffee, her eyes soft with an understanding born of seeing too many struggle in Willow Creek. The town had seen better days, factories had closed, and the economic downturn left its mark on every cracked sidewalk and shuttered storefront, a landscape of loss that mirrored Danny's own. Scenes like this weren't uncommon, but they never got easier to witness, each one a reminder of the fragility of pride. Without a word, Danny waved Clara over, his heart thudding with a mix of resolve and uncertainty, the diner's warmth suddenly stifling. "Add his bill to mine," he whispered, his voice steady but low, the words barely audible over the hum of the diner's ancient heater, the air thick with the scent of bacon grease and burnt toast. Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing with concern, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "Danny, you don't have to," he cut her off with a shake of his head, his jaw tight, his eyes pleading. "Please, don't tell him it was me." But as any Marine knows, plans rarely go as expected, and the air in the diner shifted with a tension Danny hadn't felt since his last patrol in Kuwait, the kind that made your skin prickle and your breath catch. Clara returned to the elderly man, her voice gentle as she explained his meal was covered, her words a soft balm against the man's quiet struggle. The man straightened, his posture shifting with a dignity that seemed to erase years from his frame, his shoulders squaring as if he were back on a battlefield. His sharp eyes, a piercing blue that belied his age, scanned the diner, landing on Danny with an intensity that made the younger man's heart race, a spotlight he couldn't escape. It was the same tension Danny had felt on patrol, the feeling of being exposed with no cover to retreat to, the desert sun replaced by the diner's flickering fluorescent lights. There buzz a faint echo of danger. The man gathered his belongings, a worn leather wallet, a faded handkerchief that smelled faintly of tobacco, and what Danny now realized was a military coin, its edges worn smooth from years of being handled, a token of a past Danny could only imagine. He walked toward Danny with deliberate steps, each one echoing on the linoleum floor, the sound a drumbeat in Danny's ears, a march that carried the weight of history. Danny's pulse quickened, his palms sweating as he gripped his coffee mug, the ceramic hot against his skin. Had he overstepped? Had his act of kindness been a miscalculation, a civilian blunder in a world where pride was a currency more valuable than money? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, as the man approached. "You paid for my breakfast," the man said, his voice firm, not a question but a statement that cut through the diner's quiet hum, a blade of certainty in the morning's haze. Danny nodded, suddenly aware of every eye in the diner on him. Clara's curious glance, the old farmer at the counter who'd stopped mid-bite, even the cook peeking through the kitchen window, his apron smeared with grease. "It's nothing, sir. Just wanted to help," Danny said, his voice quieter than he intended, the words feeling inadequate under the man's gaze, a gaze that seemed to see straight through him. The man's eyes dropped to Danny's tattoo, the Marine Corps emblem stark against his skin, then back to his face, a flicker of recognition passing between them, a spark that lit the air. Marines don't take charity, and they don't give it. They offer respect where it's earned, the man said, his tone carrying the weight of command, a cadence Danny knew well from countless drills and orders shouted over the roar of battle, a voice that could silence a battlefield. "What unit?" the man asked, his voice steady, demanding an answer, the question a test Danny couldn't fail. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, sir," Danny replied, the response automatic, drilled into him through years of service, his body tensing as if awaiting inspection. The man extended a hand, steady now despite its earlier tremble, the gesture a bridge across decades, a connection forged in an instant. Korea, 1st Marine Division, 1950. Colonel Edward Marshall, retired, he said, his voice a quiet thunder, the name a banner of honor. Danny stood instantly, the respect instinctive, his body snapping to attention as if he were back on the parade ground, the diner fading away until it was just him and the colonel. A Korean War veteran, and a colonel, no less. A man who'd likely seen the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir, where Marines fought against impossible odds, their breath freezing in the air, their blood staining the snow. In that moment, Danny realized his act of kindness might have been misread, a civilian gesture that clashed with military pride, a mistake that could wound more than it healed. He'd seen young officers in the Corps make similar errors, assuming weakness where there was only strength, and the correction was always swift, a lesson in humility delivered with the precision of a bayonet, a reminder of the code that bound them. His mind raced, searching for the right protocol in this civilian diner, facing a man who outranked him by decades of service and experience, a man whose very presence commanded respect. "Sir, I apologize if I overstepped," Danny said, standing at parade rest, his voice tight with uncertainty, his heart pounding as if he were facing a court-martial, the weight of his mistake a stone in his chest. Colonel Marshall studied him, his eyes sharp despite the lines etched into his face, a calculated assessment that reminded Danny of his old commanding officer in Kuwait, a man who could read a battlefield in a glance. "At ease, Sergeant. Your instincts were sound, even if your intel was off," the colonel said, his voice carrying no anger, only the measured tone of a leader assessing a tactical move, a tone that eased the knot in Danny's chest. He gestured to the stool beside Danny, the motion firm, a silent command. "May I join you? We have some things to discuss." It wasn't a request, and Danny knew it, the command phrasing as familiar as a rifle in his hands, a call to attention he couldn't ignore. As they sat, the colonel pulled a metal case from his pocket, the hinges creaking as he opened it to reveal a collection of military challenge coins, their surfaces gleaming under the diner's lights. Danny's breath caught. These weren't pocket change, as he'd assumed, but sacred tokens of service, each one a story of brotherhood and sacrifice, their emblems etched with the ghosts of units long disbanded, battles long won. "I wasn't counting pennies, son," the colonel said, flexing fingers gnarled by arthritis, the joints swollen and red, a map of pain etched into his skin. "These hands just don't work like they used to. Carrying these coins keeps my men close. Some days, they're all I have left," he said, his voice soft but heavy, the words a confession of a loneliness Danny understood too well. The weight of the misunderstanding settled on Danny like a heavy fog, a mix of shame and awe swirling in his chest, a realization that he'd seen struggle where there was only ritual, a veteran's way of holding onto the past. The colonel's next words cut through the haze, sharp and direct, a command that demanded truth. "Tell me about Desert Storm." For the next hour, as Clara refilled their coffee cups on the house, the bitter aroma mixing with the scent of bacon grease, the two Marines shared a conversation unlike any Danny had experienced since leaving the Corps, a dialogue that stripped away the years and the wars that separated them. The colonel's questions were direct, piercing through the walls Danny had built around his memories, each one a scalpel slicing into wounds he'd tried to bury, wounds that bled in the quiet of the night. "Did you lose any men under your command?" the colonel asked, his gaze unyielding, his blue eyes like a winter sky, cold and clear, a mirror to the frozen hills he'd once fought on. The question hit Danny like a physical blow, memories of sand and smoke flooding back, the acrid smell of burning metal, the screams of his men echoing in his ears, a cacophony he couldn't silence. Two of his men, Jackson and Lee, had died when their vehicle hit an unmarked mine, the explosion a thunderclap that shattered the desert silence, the flames a hellish glow against the night. Danny had been the vehicle commander, his orders leading them down that cursed path, and the guilt still clawed at him in the quiet hours, a beast that refused to be tamed, its teeth sharp with the names of the fallen. "Two, sir," he answered, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest, the names heavy on his tongue, a litany of loss. Jackson and Lee. I couldn't get to them in time. The colonel nodded, his eyes distant but understanding, a flicker of shared pain passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the cost of command. Loss never leaves you, son, but it shapes you, he said, his voice low, the words a lifeline thrown across the years, a bridge between their battles. Those words lingered as they talked, the diner fading into the background, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of other patrons becoming a distant hum, a world apart from the one they shared. What Danny had thought was a quick breakfast turned into a 2-hour exchange that felt like a lifeline, a bridge between two warriors who'd fought in different wars but carried the same scars, their wounds invisible but no less real. The colonel wasn't struggling to pay. He'd been organizing his coins, a ritual from his days in Korea, each one a memory of a man he'd led, a battle he'd survived. Saved my life once, he explained, his voice low, the memory pulling him back to a frozen night in 1950, his breath visible in the icy air. Got separated during a night op. That coin was the only way I could prove who I was to our lines. Stumbling through the snow, half dead from the cold, my men's voices a distant hope. Danny listened, the weight of the colonel's history sinking in, a testament to resilience that made his own struggles feel both smaller and more bearable, a shared burden that lightened the load. As they spoke, Danny learned the colonel lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town, a small clapboard structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, its windows dark with the weight of memory. His wife had passed a decade ago, her laughter a ghost that haunted the empty rooms, her absence a silence that echoed louder than any battle. They'd had no children to fill the void, no laughter to chase away the shadows, and the colonel had moved to Willow Creek to escape the ghosts of war, the memories of Korea's frozen hills, and the men he'd buried there, their faces etched into his mind like scars. But the ghosts followed him still, whispering in the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind through the pines, a chorus of the fallen that never let him rest. The hardest part isn't the fighting, the colonel said, his voice heavy with decades of reflection, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug as if seeking warmth, the ceramic chipped but steady in his grip. It's coming home to a world that's moved on without you. Finding purpose again, that's the real battle, he said, his words a mirror to Danny's own struggle, a truth that cut deeper than any blade. The words struck Danny like a thunderclap, naming the emptiness he'd felt since returning from Kuwait, the hollow ache that no amount of engine oil or overtime could fill, a void that had grown with every sleepless night. He'd been adrift, a ship without a harbor, and the colonel's words were a map to a shore he hadn't known existed, a beacon in the fog of his homecoming. Danny glanced at his watch, his stomach dropping as the hands ticked past 10 a.m., the realization hitting him like a cold wave, a jolt of panic that broke the spell of their conversation. He was 2 hours late for work, the minutes slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Sir, I need to call my boss. I'm overdue for my shift," he said, his voice tight with panic, the diner's warmth suddenly stifling, the air thick with the weight of his mistake. The colonel nodded, understanding the conflict, his expression calm but firm, a leader who'd seen men falter and rise again. "Use the phone at the counter. Tell your boss you're with Colonel Marshall. If he gives you trouble, put him on with me," he said, his voice a steady anchor, a promise of support that Danny clung to. Danny stepped away, his heart pounding as he dialed Harper's auto shop, the rotary phone's clicks loud in his ears, each one a heartbeat of dread. His boss's voice was cold, a blade of ice through the line, sharp and unyielding. "Don't bother coming in today, tomorrow, or ever, Carter," Harper said, his words a guillotine that severed Danny's fragile foothold in civilian life. Danny's shoulders tensed, but he kept his tone neutral, the Marine in him refusing to show weakness, even as the loss hit him like a fresh wound on top of old scars, a new scar to add to the collection. The colonel's response was unexpected, his voice steady as he sipped his coffee, the steam rising like a ghost between them. "His loss," he said simply, the words a quiet rebuke to Harper's short-sightedness, a dismissal that carried the weight of a general's command. "Tell me, Sergeant, how much do you know about military vehicles?" he asked, his tone shifting, a spark of something new in his eyes. Danny blinked, caught off guard, the question pulling him from the spiral of his thoughts, a lifeline in the storm of his uncertainty. "Enough to keep Humvees running through sandstorms in Kuwait, sir," he replied, his voice steadier now, the memory of those desert nights grounding him, the roar of engines a comfort in the chaos. The colonel's eyes lit up, a spark of hope, perhaps, or the ghost of a plan, a vision taking shape in the lines of his weathered face. "I've been restoring vintage military vehicles as a hobby, but these hands can't do the work anymore. I could use someone with your skills. Not charity, fair pay for fair work," he said, his voice firm, the offer a bridge to a future Danny hadn't dared to imagine. Danny hesitated, his mind racing, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. The pay wouldn't match his mechanic's wage, but the offer held something more valuable. Purpose, a chance to reclaim a piece of the life he'd lost when he left the Corps, a mission that felt like coming home. "I'd be honored, sir," he finally said, the words a commitment he felt in his bones, a vow as sacred as any oath he'd taken. Before they parted, the colonel pressed a challenge coin into Danny's hand, the metal cool against his palm, its weight a promise. "This was given to me after chosen," he said, his voice thick with memory, the weight of that frozen battle in every syllable, the cold of that winter seeping into his words. "You're facing your own chosen now, the battle to find your place. Carry this as a reminder you're not alone," he said, his eyes locking onto Danny's, a silent pact between warriors. The coin, bearing the 1st Marine Division emblem, felt heavier than its size, worn smooth from years of being carried, a talisman of survival, its surface a map of the colonel's journey. That evening, as Danny sat in his apartment, staring at the coin, its edges catching the dim light of his lamp, the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a siren. It was Harper, his voice gruff but tinged with something like regret, a crack in his usual armor. "Got a call from some colonel today. Said I'd made a mistake letting you go. Said you're one of the best mechanics he's ever met. Which is nonsense since he's never seen you work," he said, his words halting, a man unaccustomed to admitting fault. A pause, heavy with unspoken apologies, hung between them. He also mentioned friends at the VA and the Marine Corps Association. Harper added, the weight of the colonel's influence clear in his tone. Danny smiled, recognizing the colonel's tactical pressure, a maneuver as precise as any battlefield strategy, a reminder of the power of rank and respect. "What are you saying, Mr. Harper?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, a Marine's steadiness in the face of uncertainty. "I'm saying your job's still here if you want it. And maybe we can adjust your hours so you can work with this colonel, too," Harper said, his tone softer now, a concession won by the colonel's quiet authority. By the next morning, Danny had not only reclaimed his job, but gained something far greater. A mentor who understood the void left by military service, and a mission that bridged his past and future, a path forward illuminated by the colonel's faith in him. The coin sat on his nightstand, a quiet promise of what was to come, its surface catching the first light of dawn, a beacon in the darkness of his uncertainty. What began as a chance encounter evolved into a lifeline for both men, a bond that grew with each shared moment. Danny started visiting the colonel regularly, at first just for coffee or to fix a leaky faucet in the older man's modest home, the small acts a way to repay the man who'd given him hope. The house was a time capsule. Photos from military postings worldwide lined the walls, their frames yellowed with age, each one a window into a life of service. Shelves of history books sagged under their own weight, their spines cracked from years of reading, their pages filled with the battles the colonel had lived, and a stunning collection of challenge coins sat in handcrafted wooden cases, each one a story waiting to be told, a testament to the men he'd led. The air smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, a scent that wrapped Danny in a sense of history he couldn't quite name, a connection to a past that felt both foreign and familiar. 2 months later, the colonel posed a question that would change everything, his voice steady but tinged with a vulnerability Danny hadn't heard before. "How much do you know about motorcycles?" he asked, his eyes searching Danny's, a quiet hope in their depths. In the garage, under a dusty tarp that hadn't been touched in years, sat a 1942 Harley-Davidson WLA, the Liberator, used by the U.S. military in World War II, its chrome dulled by time, but still gleaming with potential. It had belonged to the colonel's brother, who died as a dispatch rider during the Battle of the Bulge, his last message delivered at the cost of his life, a sacrifice that had saved countless others. "I've kept it all these years," the colonel said, his voice soft, the words heavy with grief, a wound that had never healed. "But I can't restore it anymore. It'd be a shame to let it rust away," he said, his eyes pleading, a silent request for Danny to carry on a legacy he could no longer hold. For the next 3 years, Danny spent weekends in the colonel's garage, meticulously restoring the historic motorcycle, the work of balm for his restless soul, a purpose that filled the void he'd carried since Kuwait. The project became his anchor, a tangible connection to the past that gave him meaning, each turn of the wrench a step toward healing, a way to honor the colonel's brother and the men Danny had lost. The garage was a sanctuary, its walls lined with tools and faded posters of military campaigns, the air thick with the scent of grease and metal polish, a smell that grounded Danny in the present while connecting him to the past. The colonel supervised, sharing stories of his brother's bravery, his voice cracking with pride and loss, the memories as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday, each tale a thread in the tapestry of their bond. He rode through enemy lines to deliver a message that saved our platoon, the colonel said one afternoon, his eyes distant as he watched Danny tighten a bolt, the clink of metal a quiet rhythm in the garage. "Never made it back. I promised I'd keep his bike alive," he said, his voice breaking, the weight of that promise a burden he'd carried for decades. Saturdays were for the bike, with Danny's hands covered in grease, his fingers stained black, the work of meditation that quieted the ghosts in his mind, while the colonel watched from a stool, offering pointers with the precision of a drill instructor, his voice a steady guide. Sundays were for fishing at Willow Lake, where they sat in companionable silence, the colonel teaching Danny fly fishing with the same patience he'd once used to lead men into battle, his hands steady as he cast the line. The lake's surface shimmered under the sun, the water cold against their hands, the quiet broken only by the splash of a fish or the rustle of leaves in the breeze, a peace that felt like a gift. By the second year, Danny had moved into the colonel's spare bedroom, the decision a practical one, but also a symbol of their growing bond. "Makes more sense than driving across town every day," the colonel had said, his tone firm but warm, a fatherly edge to his words that made Danny's chest ache with gratitude. Danny paid rent. Though he suspected the money went into a savings account the colonel never mentioned, a quiet act of care that spoke louder than words, a testament to the family they'd become. One evening, as they worked on the Harley, the garage filled with the scent of oil and metal, a familiar comfort in the fading light, Danny noticed the colonel staring at a faded photo of his brother pinned to the wall, the edges curled from years of being touched, a relic of a life cut short. The older man's hands trembled, not from arthritis, but from a memory too heavy to hold, the photo a portal to a past he couldn't escape. He was 22 when he died. The colonel whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the garage heater, the words raw with a grief that hadn't dulled in decades, a wound that bled anew with every glance. "I promised I'd keep his bike alive. Never thought I'd need someone else to finish that promise," he said, his eyes glistening, the vulnerability a stark contrast to the commander Danny had first met. Danny felt a lump in his throat, the weight of the colonel's trust pressing against his chest like a physical force, a responsibility he couldn't fail. He tightened a bolt, his own hands steady, but his heart ached with the unspoken bond forming between them, a bond forged not just by service, but by shared loss, by the ghosts they both carried, a brotherhood that transcended time. He thought of Jackson and Lee, their laughter echoing in his memory, their faces as clear as the day he'd lost them, and for the first time, he felt the weight of their deaths shift, not lighter, but shared, a burden carried by two instead of one. Then came a day that shifted everything, a moment that would redefine the colonel's legacy and Danny's future. The colonel received a call from the Marine Corps Historical Division. They'd been searching for him for years, their voices crackling through the old rotary phone in the living room, a lifeline to a past he'd thought was buried. During the brutal retreat from the chosen reservoir, then Lieutenant Marshall had secured critical intelligence documents mapping North Korean positions, his hands frostbitten as he stuffed the papers into his coat, his men falling around him in the snow, their cries swallowed by the wind. Those papers had been lost in the chaos of war, creating a gap in historical records that had puzzled historians for decades, a mystery that had lingered in the shadows of the Pentagon's archives. What the colonel didn't know was that they'd been used by military intelligence throughout the Cold War, shaping operations for decades, their impact hidden behind layers of classification, a silent legacy that had saved countless lives. They were just field orders, the colonel told Danny, his tone dismissive as he hung up the phone, his hands shaking slightly, not from age but from the weight of memory. I was told to bring them back, so I did. Nothing heroic about following orders, he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of pride, a spark that belied his words, a hint of the young lieutenant who defied the odds. But there was more, a secret that had been buried in the Pentagon's archives for years, a truth that would rewrite the colonel's story. The documents had informed strategic models that prevented conflicts with North Korea, their impact classified until now, a silent legacy that had shaped the course of history. When Pentagon officials arrived at the colonel's home, Danny was there, elbow deep in the Harley's engine, the smell of gasoline sharp in the air, his hands stained with the work of restoration. The officials were struck by the sight. Two Marines, generations apart, working side by side, the past and present intertwined in the hum of the garage, a living testament to the enduring bond of service. A general with intelligence division insignia presented the colonel with a presidential unit citation and a classified commendation, requiring a temporary security clearance just to receive. The ceremony a quiet affair under the garage's flickering bulb, the light casting long shadows on the walls. Your actions at Chosin didn't just win that battle, the general said, his voice steady, the weight of history in every word, a tribute to a man who'd never sought glory. They shaped American strategy for 50 years, he said, his words a revelation that hung in the air, a truth the colonel had never known. The colonel, ever humble, simply nodded, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture a soldier's even in retirement. Any Marine would have done the same, sir, he said, his voice steady, a quiet defiance in his humility. That evening, the colonel shared a bottle of rare whiskey with Danny, the amber liquid catching the light as they sat in the quiet garage, the Harley gleaming in the corner like a sentinel, a symbol of their shared journey. Funny thing about service, the colonel said, his voice soft with reflection, the whiskey's warmth a contrast to the chill of his words, a chill that carried the memory of frozen battlefields. You never know which actions will matter most. I carried those papers for years, never knowing their true weight, he said, his eyes distant, the glass trembling slightly in his hand. Danny swirled his glass, the whiskies burn a mirror to the fire in his chest, the colonel's words a reminder of the unseen ripples of their actions, a lesson in the quiet power of duty. Sometimes, the most significant moments in history aren't recorded. They're passed quietly from one generation to the next, like a torch in the dark, its flame flickering but never extinguished, a light that guides even in the deepest night. 7 years after their first meeting at Mabel's diner, Colonel Edward Marshall passed away peacefully in his sleep at 87, his final breath a whisper in the night. Danny was by his side, having moved into the spare bedroom 2 years earlier as the colonel's health declined, the older man's breaths growing shallower with each passing day, a slow fade that Danny couldn't stop. In those final years, their bond had deepened. The colonel became the father Danny never had, his gruff wisdom a guiding light through the fog of civilian life. And Danny the son the colonel never knew he needed, his presence a comfort in the quiet nights, a hand to hold as the shadows closed in. Together, they'd finished the Harley, its chrome gleaming like it had just rolled off the factory floor in 1942, a testament to their shared journey, a monument to the men they'd both lost. The night after the funeral, Danny sat alone in the garage, the silence deafening, the air heavy with the scent of oil and memory, a weight that pressed against his chest. He ran his fingers over the Harley's curves, the metal cold under his touch, its surface a mirror to his grief, and let the tears fall. Tears for the man who'd given him purpose, for the brother the colonel had lost, and for the future he now had to face alone. The weight of the colonel's absence a physical ache in his chest, a void that echoed with the laughter they'd shared. 3 weeks later, Danny received a letter summoning him to the office of the colonel's attorney, Mr. Lawrence. The envelope crisp and official, its weight heavy in his hands, a harbinger of change. He expected to discuss funeral costs or perhaps a small keepsake, a token to remember the man who'd changed his life, a memento to hold on to in the quiet nights. Instead, Mr. Lawrence handed him a sealed envelope with "Read this first," written in the Colonel's precise handwriting. The ink as steady as the man himself had been, a final message from beyond the grave. Danny's hands shook as he opened it, the scent of the Colonel's old cologne lingering on the paper, a faint whisper of cedar and tobacco that brought the older man's presence rushing back, a memory so vivid it stole his breath. The letter began, "Danny, if you're reading this, I've received my final orders for deployment." The words a quiet command, a final order from a man who'd led with honor. The words blurred as tears welled in Danny's eyes, the weight of loss crashing over him like a wave, the grief a storm he couldn't outrun, a tempest that carried the Colonel's voice in its winds. The Colonel had named Danny the sole beneficiary of his entire estate, a revelation that stunned him into silence. "I don't understand," Danny stammered, his voice thick with emotion, the words catching in his throat, a knot of disbelief and gratitude. "This should go to his family," he said, his hands trembling as he clutched the letter, the paper crinkling under his grip. Mr. Lawrence smiled gently, his eyes kind behind his glasses, a warmth that softened the formality of the moment. "You were his family, Mr. Carter. He made that clear," he said, his voice steady, a confirmation of the bond Danny had felt but never named. The estate was more than the modest house Danny had expected, its value a secret the Colonel had kept close, a treasure hidden in plain sight. The Colonel had lived simply, investing his pension and family inheritance over decades, a quiet strategy that spoke of foresight and sacrifice, a life of service that extended beyond the battlefield. It included investment accounts, land holdings, and rare military collectibles, valued at over $3.1 million, a fortune that seemed impossible for the man who'd lived so humbly. But the true gift was the purpose the Colonel left behind, a legacy that would outlive them both, a mission that would carry their bond into the future. The Colonel's letter held more than words. It held a secret Danny never saw coming, a mystery that had been hidden in the simplicity of the Colonel's life. "I've lived modestly for a reason," the Colonel wrote, his handwriting steady despite the years, a testament to the man who'd never wavered. "But what I'm leaving you isn't just money. It's a mission," he wrote, the words a call to arms, a challenge that stirred Danny's soul. Danny's heart raced as he read on, the attorney watching silently, his expression unreadable, a witness to a moment that would change everything. What could the Colonel have meant? The answer lay in the final paragraph, a revelation that would redefine Danny's future, a call to action that would echo through generations, a legacy that would live on in the lives it touched. The letter detailed the Colonel's vision, a veterans transition program to help returning service members find their place in civilian life, a beacon for those lost in the fog of homecoming, a light to guide them home. "You saw something in me that day at the diner," the Colonel wrote, his words a whisper from beyond the grave, a voice that carried the weight of their shared journey. Not just an old man with shaky hands, but a warrior carrying his battles. "Now I'm asking you to see it in others. The hardest fight isn't on the battlefield, it's finding your way home," he wrote, his words a command, a mission that felt as sacred as any order Danny had ever received. Danny clutched the letter, the Colonel's words echoing in his mind, a call to action he couldn't ignore, a purpose that filled the void he'd carried for so long. Underscore. Conclusion: meaningful reflection with powerful CTAs. 1 month later, Danny used the Colonel's inheritance to establish the Marshall Transition Initiative, a program designed by veterans, for veterans, a lifeline for those struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. The restored Harley-Davidson became its symbol, a piece of history given new life, just like the veterans it served, a testament to resilience and renewal. Starting small in the Colonel's garage, Danny offered mechanical training to 4 veterans, their laughter and the clinking of tools filling the space with hope, a sound that echoed the camaraderie he'd once known in the Corps. Within 2 years, the program expanded, purchasing a larger facility in Lincoln and adding job placement, PTSD counseling, and family support services, each new program a brick in the foundation of the Colonel's legacy. The Pentagon general who'd honored the Colonel joined the advisory board, securing grants that helped the initiative reach hundreds, a network of support that spanned generations, a bridge between the past and the future. 5 years later, Danny stood before a crowd at the opening of their new facility in Omaha, the sun glinting off the building's glass facade, a beacon of hope in the heart of the city. The program had helped over 600 veterans transition to civilian life, their stories of resilience echoing the Colonel's legacy, a chorus of voices that spoke of healing and purpose. As Danny cut the ribbon, he wore the Colonel's Korean War service pin on his lapel, the medal a quiet reminder of the man who'd changed his life, and the challenge coin heavy in his pocket, its weight a promise kept. The Harley stood in the lobby, a gleaming testament to persistence and the bond between warriors, its chrome reflecting the faces of those it had helped. Danny's voice trembled as he spoke, the words a tribute to the man who'd given him everything. This isn't just a building, it's a promise kept. To Colonel Marshall, and to every veteran who feels lost. "You're not alone," he said, his voice breaking, the crowd's applause a wave of support that carried him forward. This story reminds us that our actions create ripples we may never see, a truth that resonates in the quiet moments of our lives. A simple gesture, paying for a meal, connected two men across generations, one moment of kindness growing into a legacy that transforms lives, a testament to the power of compassion. True courage isn't just on battlefields. It's in recognizing the humanity in others, in everyday moments that seem small but carry immense weight, moments that can change the course of a life. Danny and Colonel Marshall show us that real strength lies in compassion, in seeing beyond appearances and acting when it matters most, a lesson that echoes in the hearts of all who hear their story. Take a moment to reflect. Has a veteran's kindness ever touched your life? Maybe a small gesture that stayed with you, a moment of connection that reminded you of the power of humanity? Share your story in the comments below. Your experiences fuel the mission of the Marshall Initiative in this community. Let's honor the warriors among us by keeping their stories alive, by building a tapestry of kindness that spans generations. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to sharing tales like this, stories of ordinary people who stand tall when it counts, who lift others up with quiet strength, who remind us of the values that bind us together. If you believe in the power of courage, compassion, and connection, don't miss out. Hit subscribe right now to join our community. Don't wait, because next week we're sharing the story of a former Navy SEAL who risked everything to save a stranded hiker during a blizzard, with a twist you'll never see coming. Time's ticking. Subscribe, comment, and share this story today to keep these legacies alive, to ensure that the ripples of kindness continue to spread, touching lives we may never know.